I can't let you go with asking you about my best friend here of 32 years. Now, I know you was a high-ranking officer, and I'm sure you heard of Dave, and
Well,
I believe
him,
you met him, and I believe you even witnessed the Austin Warren's training video.
Yeah, how it come about, because he did become a big name, but this is in the early 90s, and I was working at Woolwich, and I can remember part of my duties as a uniform cop, they'd stick you on the front desk, and it was a bit of a messy place to work anyway. And I can always remember a detective come down, and it turned out it was Dave Courtney was with him, and he had a Jag car, and I don't know what had happened, whether he got done for drink driving or something, I don't know. Anyway, he wasn't allowed to drive. I don't know if he'd been in custody or whatever. So this detective said, look, son, do me a favour. He said, we'll cover you on the front desk. Can you just take this guy, drive his car, drop him off home and walk back? It's not far. You'll be doing him one a favour and you'll be doing him a favour. And I said, yeah, okay, yeah, no worries. Anyway, so I'm getting his car and I drive him home. And he chatting away. And back then he had a beard, didn't he? And he lived on the Morris Walker estate. I always remember that. And I think his missus was the black girl.
Frederick Ash, yeah.
And he said, come and have a cup of tea. I said, well, I've got to get back to work. He went, no, have a cup of tea first. So they made me a cup of tea and had me tea, and then I walked back to the Nick. And then it was, there was a pub along there that it turned out he owned.
That's right, the Albion.
Someone would say, Dodgy Dave's pub. Dodgy Dave owns that. Do you know who he is? And I went, no. And it was only a couple of years later that there was a TV programme. I thought, oh, that's that guy. That's because I thought he was like three different people.
Yeah.
And, and then I sort of met him with Chris Lambriano a bit later on. But the Austin's Warren thing, see, that become really interesting because he was at Plumstead as a detective when I was there as a uniformed copper, and certain areas had a quite endemic corruption, and the CID at Plumstead had a bit of a reputation as being one of them areas, and there was this thing going on because there'd been a guy called Daniel Morgan had been murdered in the pub down in Sydenham. And that linked in with the Catford CID, and there was a guy there called Sid Fillery, who's a detective sergeant, who again was a bully, corrupt guy, and turned out to be a convicted paedophile as well, Sid Fillery. And he was linked in with a group called Southern Investigations, a private eye group, and they were just corrupt. There was all stuff about selling information and all that going on. But that detective agency had influence over who went into the CID at Plumstead. So if Plumstead and Woolwich were part of the same sort of area, as it were, for policing, you flip between the two. So if a uniform copper like myself was, qualified really to become a detective, you'd have to be selected by the other cops. They'd have to accept that you're one of them. And some of the people who had to say for it were Southern Investigations. Officially, nothing to do with them, but they wanted their own people in the CID. They wanted to manage their own. And of course, one of them detectives was Austin Warren's. And circa about 2000 and maybe 6, 7 or something like that, maybe around that time, I got a job at the detective training school. I was a detective, and I needed time out because I've been on child protection, and it was sort of get me down a bit. I had a bit of a drink problem from it, and then my kids were at home, and so, but I was a good interviewer, so they offered me a job doing the interview training for the detective training school, and the anti-corruption command had an input, and they had this video, and they brought in about police corruption. And it was for police eyes only, shall we say, but some of it did come public domain. And it was all to do with this guy, Austin Warren's. And they show him up on Plumstead Common. I think he was talking with Dave. They had it under surveillance.
Yeah, Dave had it recorded that day.
I think he was double bluffing it as well when he recorded it. And I think in a car as well, there was conversation. So Warren's didn't realise it. And what he had done is... that something to do with his summer investigations. They needed a copper to stitch a woman up with drugs.
That's right, yeah.
Now, what you've got to do is this woman, she was straight going. There was nothing wrong with that.
The guy, what actually happened there was the guy who was married to that woman, she was getting a divorce from him.
Right.
And he had found out and wanted custody of his children. So he asked Austin, through that agency, to plant the drugs on this woman so as he would then get custody of the kids.
Right.
And he paid Austin a substantial amount of money for that. That was common knowledge.
And what Austin now had to do was build up an intelligence profile to say that this is an ongoing thing, and it is a corrupt practice. So what you do is, if you want to get someone, you'd be putting on an intelligence report. Oh, so and so is drug dealing. Was approached by a member of public and said, so and so doing it, but you put it as anonymous people. And so what Austin's done is he's quickly got to build a profile of this woman, and he's put it down that Dave's given him the information, about this. Well, of course, it's unverifiable information because it didn't exist.
Yeah.
And so what the corruption command have done is they call it the provenance. They've checked it and said, well, okay, if that's the case, because you start going into the world of like registered and unregistered informants, right? So part of it would be like Crime Stoppers.
Yeah.
It's unregistered information. And there's others that are registered informants. And they're people that will be used under a pseudonym name. There'll be a docket held at the police station in a secure cabinet. Only a few people allowed in it. So if say, Liam become an informant, his name, we'd call him Peter Smith, for example, and then have a pseudonym. So we're meeting Peter Smith, so no one knows who he is and everything else. And the visits will all be recorded. There's a strict practice around that. Well, of course, Austin didn't have none of that. It didn't exist,
So he was quickly trying to make this.
Making it up, but it's easily verifiable. But ordinarily, a copper can't gain access to that because, right? So if I go to a court case and I say, or Liam, so what happened with me with one of the cases with the big heroin job? The guy was driving this 330 kilos of heroin. He thinks I'm being followed. I'm in trouble here. So he puts a call in to me, right? He's a criminal. He's on bail to me for something else, right? And he rings my phone loads of times. Can't get through to me because I'm on the underground coming into work. So he calls my work and says, need to talk to Jon Wedger, really urgent. Who are you? Puts the phone down. Anyway, rings back. Can I get through to the personnel department? Put him through and say, look, I'm John's cousin. His uncle's really ill. John needs to be told about this. Can I have his number so I can ring him personally and tell him what's happened? He said, ordinarily wouldn't do it. Sweet talked the personnel in. They've given my personal mobile. He leaves loads of messages on it, right? Well, of course, the National Crime Squad have got him under surveillance and they hit him, right? Bang, he gets hit. The moment he's hit, he went, hang on, I'm a participating informant for Jon Wedger, right? Here's his number, check it out. Of course, they check it out, and of course, it comes back as my phone, doesn't it? I then go to court, and they say, is this man your informant? I was, no. Are we allowed to know if someone is or isn't? No. It's a grey area. It's such a... So Austin was relying on that grey area, the fact that no one's going to check this out, and they're going to deny it if asked.
So, and I always believed, my argument with this whole thing, because I was around it at the time, right the way through,
Yeah.
and if Dave had have been an informant, they wouldn't have revealed his name.
Well, they couldn't know. They wouldn't be able to do it.
Right.
But my understanding was that he wasn't. It was, and Austin was trying to build a false profile, and didn't think that they would check it out. They didn't think that anyone would check this out.
Yeah, because he told Dave it was for a fake informant sheet.
Yeah. And he's called them the pink sheet. There were 5095 or something, the full number. And of course they've gone and checked it, and of course none of it exists. It's a lie. And that's what he's done. He's trying to build up an informant profile, stick it on Dave, on the hope that it doesn't, and the strong belief that it will never get checked out.
Yeah.
That's my understanding. Of course, it's all gone wrong, hasn't it?
Yeah, but they was actually setting Austin up. They were already watching him. They knew he was meeting Dave.
Yeah.
Because they were, on that day up on the common, they had a lip reader and camera people
Yeah.
filming that meeting, and you know, Dave recorded the meeting because he was fully aware how corrupt Austin was. He was leaving that world, didn't want to be a part of it no more, and we always felt Austin dragged him back into it, and
Yeah.
the fact that they were then allowed to report Dave as an alleged informant, which done him a lot of damage, win the criminal fraternity, you know.
Well, of course, it's a label that you've got, and
It's almost like being labelled a paedophile in another world.
Well, it's a dangerous thing to do to someone.
Yeah.
Very dangerous. Well, I get it a lot. I get people say Jon Wedger's an MI5 informant. Well, I'm not. I mean, and I'm like, well, I should be getting paid then, or he still works. So, you know, how can you explain that he's, you know, this is always happens? But it's people's minds ticking away.
Yeah, well, everyone.
So doubt in there.
What Dave always felt with that scenario is anyone who didn't like him, who couldn't say anything about him, that give him, oh, he's a grass, so he's an informant. And, you know, that's why he went to court dressed as a court jester and beat Austin up in court. You know, that was why he done that, was to say publicly, look, this is a joke, I'm not the informant, you know what I mean? What more can I do to prove that I've had nothing to do with this? But at the time, he was labelled it in the press, which, you know, I think, for whatever reason, I think it was to maybe because of his actual, the fact that he was going to be famous, so he could have gone on to be famous. He knew a lot about corruption that Austin had been involved in.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
And I think they maybe wanted to make sure that Dave couldn't reveal that, or
well, it would have been a huge embarrassment, wouldn't it?
And it was a huge embarrassment to that whole system that Dave had actually corrupted him and had him where he wanted him.
Well, Austin was involved with all that Southern investigations, and a guy died in that. It's still an open case, you know. And that Sid Phillippe was rotten to the core. So it wasn't just Austin. There was the whole lot. There was a lot of corruption going on in there, and of course that anti-corruption lot have been in there for a while, like you said, checking into it.
Well, you know, there is a programme which you're aware of called The Real Line of Duty, which I think that case and possibly your case that you were dealing with is noted.
Yeah, mine's actually The Line of Duty. The dramatisation is of the last case, but it was used as a training video about police corruption. And the focus was put on Austin Warren's. You know, and it was quite open and obvious what the guy had done. He'd messed up. He'd screwed up. He was in trouble. And he tried to use Dave to get out of trouble. So basically what he'd done is he'd set the woman up like he was meant to, didn't realise he was being watched, and then when they actually said, right, where's this come from, the information, he's like you said, he's had to build the informant profile out of nothing. Yeah, that's right. You know, whether it was registered or unregistered, you've got to stipulate what it was. I didn't know what he stipulated, but either way it would be as an informant, and he's obviously named Dave. You know, and they would have known that probably Austin wasn't the informant handler. If Dave was an informant, there would be a docket on him. He'd have a pseudonym name. He would have been paid out, and there's all other sort of things the police can do. You know. Well, they would never have revealed him if he had been a real informant. No, of course they wouldn't have done. The protocol is they don't. They'd rather drop a case than reveal an informant. So how you can sort of detect it sometimes, there's a thing called PII. It's called Public Interest Immunity. It's when a trial's going on, and say a Cody is an informant, and they're being questioned in a box, and the line of question is actually going to reveal them as an informant, right? The prosecution will stop the trial, right? So can we clear the court? Everyone gets cleared, they'll go up to the judge, and they'll say, right, I want to bring in a PII. And it's in a secret meeting. Sometimes the other side's judges, and what it is look, the co-defendant's an informant. If you carry on that line of question with the defence doing it, it's going to expose our informants. It can't happen. So then what happens then, everyone gets back in and say, right, move on from that topic, no more questions about that, move on. And that's how you sort of recognise it, PII. It's the other thing you recognise is it used to be a crazy system. So how it works with informants, right? So someone's usually in trouble, and then someone like me goes on and offers them a lifeline. Look, here's my number. If you need me, call me. We can help, right? And usually, if they're going to be reminded, you get a call and say, what can you do for me? And you say, no, what you can do for us, right? We're in charge. This is what we want. Information on a crime bigger than you're involved in, and we can get the sentence reduced, or we can keep you in the country, or whatever it is, get your money, whatever it might be. But we need a conviction. We need a conviction. So the guy say, right, yeah, okay, but I'm a co-defendant. No problem, we can deal with that. And the first day of a trial, I'll go up to the judge and I'll hand him an envelope. And it's called a text, and it's a letter to the judge saying that one of the co-defendants is an informant. He's been productive and he will continue to be productive, right? He's given a lot of information. Please can't be taken into consideration.
So the judge then has control over the line of questioning to an extent.
Yeah. And then the sentencing. So what they'll do is you'll think, they used to say, right, you lot get 5 years, you get a year, and you're like, hang on, but they don't do that now. They say, right, everyone gets 5 years, but what I'll say to you, the informant, put it in your appeal. The others won't get it, you will. And it's through the appeal courts that you recognise now, because they had a few cases with the IRA when, one guy get life, the other get 2 years, and they're like, well, kill him.
He's gone.
I did it with a Turkish guy. He was in a lot of trouble. He said, John, I'm in big trouble. I've been caught with a lot of heroin. So I had to go up to Barlini prison in
Scotland. Wow, that's a famous prison. Yeah.
What a place.
That is rough, isn't it?
Horrible.
John, yeah.
Everyone, they call it Mars barring.
Yeah.
Everyone's got ginger hair
and
a
scar.
Yeah. And the staff are horrible. And it was the most wretched place. Anyway, this guy said, look, I need help. He said, I've been caught with quite a lot of heroin. So I said, right, okay, I'm going to deal with this. So he gives loads of info. So I put a text in to the courts. And they're not really got a grasp of it up there. And this judge was sort of like, well, I know I've got to give him a discount. So he was up for 15 years, he should have got. Anyway, he gives him 2 years. He goes ridiculously the other way. And then the next thing, I get the prison calling me up, your mate's in the infirmary, and they've just broken every bone in his body. They've had to transfer him out and everything. It caused him a nightmare.
Would you say that as a man who's in the police and worked in all that stuff, you're knowing the whole story with what you know about Dave and Austin, in your words, could Dave have been a real informant?
Well, you never know, but I doubt he would have been on doing that with the people he's around.
Yeah.
I very much doubt it. Look, right, in that criminal world, it's the same. I dealt with a lot of ex-criminals that were victims of child abuse, right? And one things that was said to me, don't ever lie to them, because they've been lied to all their life, right? And be straight up front and also be clean. And there's one guy, he's brilliant. He's a real tough man from this area called Billy Maloney, right? And he's a real campaigner, but he was a very active man in his day. And he said, John, you're the only friend I've got that I've never chinned. He's chinned every one of his friends. And he said, you being a copper as well, he said, the thing is, I can smell a wrong one. They call it a bacon, don't they? I smell bacon a mile away. And he said, especially us up in the care homes, we know a wrong one. They smell it. And that's probably what Dave would have faced, being involved with people that would smell a liar and a wrong one.
He went back to them people at the time, and I'm talking about the Joe Poles and the Freddie Foremans, and every one of them stood by him because they believed 100% he wasn't. And they all said if he had been an informant, so many would have been in prison.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
With the knowledge that Dave had, if he had been a real informant, of course, there would have been so many people in prison that never went to prison.
Well, yeah, if you look at that, he'd have been lent on every 5 minutes, wouldn't he? By the old bill, they'd be constantly bringing him up.
He spent the rest of his life blatantly abusing the authority that had labelled him that. He was very brutal in his comments and how he lived his life. So, it was... And I only say this because I had a relationship with all that time, and I could tell that if a man in profiling people, if a man does that in that situation, you'll know he'll do that in that situation. Do you understand what I mean? In certain parts of life, if you can see...
Right. Like a consistency in the behaviour.
Yeah, right? So, if Dave hadn't been an informant, he couldn't have been how he was in so many other things, because an informant has a certain way...
And maybe he would have said it in his passing note or something as well.
Yeah, well, he actually made
like
sure...
As a purge,
as in his passing, he actually said, I've done everything right for those who thought I was, you know what I mean? I proved I wasn't all the way along.
Yeah,
And it was, I just feel it was a stain on him that had he have not corrupted the policeman so bad, perhaps, he maybe got punished for corrupting him.
And also, when you're in that world, there's a lot of paranoia.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of damaged people. We need to get that right. There's a lot of people that are victims of the care homes and everything else. And look, I've had it myself. People think I'm a government agent, and they're obsessed with I'm a government agent. He works for the government, and you can't get it out of their head because they're damaged, and that's someone sowed a seed, and that's that.
Yeah, it doesn't matter. There'll be people watching this, seeing me talking to you, going, "Oh, he's a fucking grass. He's talking to a copper."
Yeah.
But like the old-fashioned criminals always believed you had to have a copper to talk to.
Yeah.
Well, all through history, that's happened.
There was always that relationship.
Yeah.
Always. You'd sit down. Like I said earlier on, even interviewing when you've got the really serious villains, you had no need to stitch them up.
Yeah.
No need. It was already done. It was what was going to happen was going to happen. There was no need to do it. There would be no... That stuff is lower down the food chain, as it were. And then you start getting very corruptible associations and like I say, they'll know stuff on eye level coppers and all sorts of... And this is what we've seen with coercion with the British government and things like that, because there's politicians that are attending these spanking dens and and all sorts of little boys clubs and everything else, and then going into work like nothing's happened, and then class it as an oversight. Oh, it was a miserror of judgment, let's move on, and nothing to see.
So Brendan, did you feel better about what Jon has said about Dave?
Well, it sort of endorses everything that I lived through with Dave, and I never had any doubt about him as a registered informant. He made it quite clear to me that Austin gave him information on the basis that Austin got paid for it, and when that situation went wrong and Austin got in trouble, he come to Dave to try and, as you've explained, to build
a false profile.
But Dave had recorded what they were saying, so when they did arrest Dave later on, I think on the M6 they arrested Dave one day, and they took him to Albany Street Police Station. I was the one who brought up the tape with the recording on it.
Right, okay.
Because we'd made copies of it, and I gave it in at Albany Street Police Station, along with some other bits, which there was no doubt.
There was probably informants giving information against Dave, because it came my way.
Yeah.
I say the National Crime Squad approached me about something to do with a boat once.
Yeah.
And then I had something from Hertfordshire Police about his connection with gangsters in Hertfordshire.
Yeah.
And that's when the name kept cropping up.
Yeah.
So he was obviously well known, and there was obviously informants giving.
So there was informants crossing him up.
It's a dirty game.
Yeah, of course it is.
It's just a dirty game.
Yeah.
Look, the most successful guy that I run, you're right in what you're saying. Everyone around him got nicked.
Yeah.
He was the last one standing.
Yeah.
There was no one left. He'd cleaned up everything,
Yeah.
So that was usually the biggest thing.
And like I said, Fred Foreman, Roy Shaw, Bruce Reynolds, all of the main players.
He would have told you as well.
Listen, 100%. And he had other people, and there's men up and down the country that know that Dave had a relationship as. I don't call them criminals. I call them associates of Dave's.
Well, the thing is, he probably could have grasped up a lot of coppers that were bang on that.
Yeah, there was
and
loads.
Probably didn't.
He knew loads of coppers that was on that.
Yeah,
but
probably didn't say anything.
And didn't say nothing.
No.
But his anger was, Dave's anger was, he wouldn't have minded being called an informant if he had been one.
Right, yeah.
But his anger after that was he was reported as an informant, but it is an alleged informant in the case, but it was enough to make him look bad, and that is why the rest of his life he spent so much anger, like he beat Austin up with venom that day in the
Yeah,
court.
yeah. Well, he screwed his life, didn't he?
He really did.
But what happened to Austin Warnes? Where, he went away, didn't he?
He went away. I mean, on the day of the court case, like I think Dave had already said to the police, the CIB3 people, he went, if you put me in the dock with that man for what he said about me, I'm beating him up in court. I don't care who's there.
Yeah.
I'm beating him up. So they had a duty of care then to keep them apart.
Keep them separate.
And we often wondered whether they half let it happen.
Yeah.
You know, because they let Austin walk in knowing Dave was there.
I was at the Inner London Crown Court at the Soviet Borough one day, and there was these two lads were going around robbing old women in Bermondsey. And so what they were doing was knocking on the door, saying, "Oh, can we have a cup of water? We're thirsty." The old woman going, "Yeah," and they were going in there, beating them up, robbing them. So it was vicious.
Nasty, yeah.
Anyway, they did this old lady and her sons were these just two gorillas that lived in the blue area of Bermondsey, you know, they were just big no-neck, bald-headed geezers, you know. And so these two lads were up for sentencing. And so the judges sentenced them, and of course this woman, her two sons have turned up. And they called out, I was dealing with a child abuse case, so they put out to the police room, can all officers in there, can you just stand by, all cases are going to be stood down until we've dealt with this sentencing, because it could be a bit of trouble, because the poor court staff couldn't deal with it. So we all get dragged down there, there's these two monsters there. And as a judge is sentencing them there, one of them calls the judge a paedophile, one of the big guys, "You're a paedophile, you're a..." and just kicks off. Right, and he said, you know, anyone comes near me, I'm gonna. And of course, the judges and everybody went, "Officers, arrest that man!" And no one wanted to touch these two boys, you know. But as you touched them, one of them whispers, "You're all right, I ain't gonna touch her, I ain't gonna touch her." And he went, "Right, contempt. Send them down for contempt." So they both get sent down for contempt. Of course, they're going to the same reception, aren't they, as these two lads?
Oh, wow.
So when they turn up at Belmarsh, they're in the reception room. They just battered them. The next day, coming to court, they said, "Do you hear what happened?" I went, "No, apparently they got hold of them and they just smashed them to pieces in the reception room with Nick." You know, that was their intention, you know. They're going to get it. They're going to get it. But yeah, it's a dangerous, murky, bizarre world, that informant thing. You know, and the thing is, they're not your friend and you're not their friend. Yeah. You know, and that's how it worked. And it was very deceptive. It was, you know, people are in trouble, and when they're in trouble, they say things, you know. So, but he wasn't in trouble.
No.
Austin was.
Yeah.
You see. So it was really, the onus is on Austin, because he was in a world of trouble.
Yeah, he was in a lot of trouble.
Yeah.